If you drive an emergency vehicle with any of these mounted on it and haven't had extensive formalized training on driving with emergency light activated, you're going to want to stick around. Alright, man, take a seat, buckle up. Ordinarily we'd start with orientation of the car here, but we got calls pending and we got to get to them. So, we're rolling. We're going to have to learn on the way. Alright, today I set the car up. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about emergency vehicle operation. If you drive with red and blue lights on, there's a good chance that you have some type of formalized training in emergency vehicle operation when the lights are activated. But if you work for, or if you're involved with some type of volunteer agency, like a volunteer fire department in ESDA, it's not always, the foremost on their minds, giving people training on how to operate emergency vehicles effectively and safely. If you work for a security company that uses green lights on the top of their squads, in my experience, the vast majority of them get absolutely no training on it at all, and it runs into problems. If you haven't had any type of formalized training on using emergency lights and your company allows you to use them, you need to rethink who you're working for, because that's not a safe situation to be in. I know that this stuff exists because I've worked at places that didn't give any formalized training but then gave people red and blue or green emergency lights to use in the course of their work and told them, well, just drive with due regard. But saying drive with due regard and reading a statute that says that you have to drive with due regard for the public no matter what you do, and that you're allowed to violate certain traffic laws when lights and sirens are activated, doesn't tell the whole story. We have to understand where the other drivers on the road are coming from and what we can realistically expect from them. And then when things go wrong, we have to have a kind of a structure for how we deal with things going wrong. What I want you to walk away from this with is a basic understanding of what the rules are for other drivers on the road, what the rules are in a nutshell for you, and some kind of guiding principles for how you should operate an emergency vehicle when you've got lights and audible warning activated. So let's look at what we're doing when we turn emergency lighting and audible warning on in our car. When we turn emergency lights on the car, and especially when we turn emergency lights and audible warning on and our car's in motion, what we're doing is we're requesting the right of way from the motoring public. And we're requesting the right of the way from the motoring public specifically in that they pull to the right and stop on the side of the road. And we do this with a mixed level of success, would be the nice way of putting it. Ideally, what we want people to do is pull to the right and stop so that there's the left lane of traffic for us to travel in, and then if we have to make a left-hand turn, traffic on the opposite side of the road is stopped, and we can make that left-hand turn without putting anybody in jeopardy. And if we have to make a right-hand turn, traffic to our right is stopped, so we don't have to worry about getting T-boned as we're pulling right from the left-hand lane. Now that's the ideal on a straightaway. And then when we come to an intersection, we want traffic to have pulled to the right and stopped and left us a left-hand lane that we can use without having to go into oncoming traffic. And then if we have to go straight through the intersection has completely stopped in all four directions, and so we can go straight through, or we can hang a right-hand turn or a left-hand turn without worrying about getting T-boned by somebody in traffic. Again, with varying levels of success. All right, so let's take a look here at what's probably our best-case scenario for when we turn the lights on while we're operating an emergency vehicle. On the straightaway, cars pull to the right and stop, and at intersections, everybody pulls to the right and stops. That's pretty much the best case scenario we can have with all the other motoring public. Now, this allows us to use the left-hand lane or the center turn lane to go around traffic, and allows us to turn at any time without having to worry about hitting cars. If we pull up here and we need to get to this side street, instead of having to deal with cars continuing to flow down the road, we can pull here, we can hang a right, and we can get onto that side street without getting T-boned. So I'm going to show you a video, and in the video, the emergency vehicle comes down the street, a couple cars pull to the right for him. When he gets to the intersection, all the traffic stops, but somebody stops inside the left lane. So he has to use the center turn lane to enter the intersection, then hang a right. But luckily, since everyone's stopping and yielding for him, it's pretty safe for him to continue on his way. This is our best case scenario. Not always the way it ends up working out, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. All right, now that we've discussed what it looks like when everything goes right, let's talk about what happens when things start going wrong. Specifically on a straightaway, instead of pulling to the right, some hapless soul decides that they're going to pull to the left and stop. So in the next video, that's exactly what I'm going to show you. This one is a 3-lane, one direction, just one side of a 6-lane highway. And there's an emergency vehicle, and he's traveling in the far left-hand lane, and cars are pulling to the right and yielding to the emergency vehicle, giving them the left-hand lane. And then one person pulls to the left and stops. Let's take a look at that. All right, so what's this person to do? Driving an ambulance or police car, everybody pulls to the right. One person pulls to the left and stops. Now, like we said, ideally, we're supposed to be passing people on the left. The reason that we're passing people on the left is because by turning our lights and siren on, we're telling them to move to the right and stop. So if we pass someone on the right and they decide at that moment that they're going to merge, they're going to move to the right, they're going to hit us, and guess whose fault it's going to be? It's going to be ours. Sometimes passing people on the right, though, is unavoidable. In that circumstance, what other reason would this person have for pulling to the left and stopping if they weren't trying to yield to the emergency vehicle? Well, they could be broken down, in which case they're not going to pull to the right and hit us, or they could be yielding to the emergency vehicle, in which case they're pulling to the left and they're stopping until we pass them. So we can kind of infer that there's nothing that this person is going to be doing other than sitting there in traffic. And we don't have any other option but to drive around them to the right. The key here is necessity. We don't want to pass people on the right. We want to pass them on the left when we have our lights on. It's necessary, though, in this situation, to pass around to the right. Let's look at that. All right, so now we've seen the whole thing, and you can kind of see what happened. Note, though, how quickly it all goes down. You don't have time to think about the situation and to legally analyze it. So we have to know in advance what we're going to do if certain circumstances pop up. All right, now let's look at some circumstances where passing on the right should probably be avoided. I'm going to show you a video here, and in this particular circumstance, it's of a pursuit. But for our purposes, we're just going to pretend that it's a response to a normal call. And once again, we've got one side of a 6-lane highway, so 3 lanes all going the same direction, and the squad is approaching a white pickup truck that's in the middle lane of traffic. Now, if the call is a few blocks down the road, there's no reason really to be passing the truck anywhere but on the left unless there's somebody here or something here blocking us. So let's take a look at it. All right, so as you saw, the squad comes around, goes around the right-hand side of the truck on the roadway, and continues on. Now, that truck, the driver of the truck, has shown no sign of having even seen the squad car, right? He's continuing down the road. He hasn't changed lanes. He's not slowing down. Brake lights aren't coming on. No sign that he's rolling. There's no sign that that truck has even seen us. So what happens if we get right about here and are going around him, and he sees the lights when they hit his passenger side mirror and decides he's going to pull to the right and stop because he's afraid he thinks he's going to get pulled over? Well, he's going to hit us. This is going to be a really rough situation had that truck moved over for the cop in the squad to explain to his boss. Not to mention, he could get somebody very seriously injured. So why was going around on the right such a bad idea in that circumstance? Well, first we have to understand that, like many things in public safety work, every decision that we make driving code is a calculated risk. Nothing we do is ever going to be 100% safe once those lights come on. Our job is to mitigate that risk as much as possible, if for no other reason than it just doesn't pay to crash. The second point we have to understand is the difference between doing something out of necessity versus doing something out of expediency. There are times when our decisions can be based on the necessity for expediency, but expediency alone should not generally be our reason for taking on a risk. So in the first scenario, we had nowhere to go but to the right. Stopping and waiting for, or more likely having to get out and explain to the driver to pull to the right, would have likely taken so long to get the point across to the driver that it would put the public in undue danger because of the delay in our response. Also would have put the public in undue danger because we'd be stopping our vehicle in the middle of the interstate highway and creating even more risk. When we weigh that risk against the relatively low risk that the driver who pulls to the left and stops on the side of the highway is going to suddenly remember to pull to the right and hit us, we're left with no other option. It is necessary to go around on the right. In the second scenario I showed you, there is a left lane open for us to use. There's no evident exigent necessity to pass on the right, and the risk of the driver in the white pickup who has shown no sign of seeing us is going to suddenly pull to the right as we're passing is relatively high. Since we're already at the right-hand side of the road, it may be expedient to pass on the right, but it's not necessary to do so, especially given the risk involved. Now let's look at another incident, but in a different type of roadway, where it may be necessary to break our rule about always passing on the left of traffic that is traveling parallel to us. In this case, we have a major suburban thoroughfare with left turn lanes. It's very common for people to pull into the left turn lane instead of pulling to the right. Whether this is out of ignorance or laziness is irrelevant. Let's take a look. Alright, so here we see several cars pulling into the left turn lane. Now, using our previous structure, these drivers are likely either yielding to our warning equipment or never saw us and are trying to turn left. Either way, a sudden right-hand turn causing a collision is relatively unlikely. There's a raised median that keeps us from passing them on the left, and even if there was not that physical barrier to passing on the left, going into oncoming traffic is not necessarily safer, and the likelihood in that case of the person turning left because they never saw us and striking us as we pass them on the left will be much higher than just passing them on the right. This is not to say that we should never go into oncoming traffic. In fact, it's often necessary to do so. There's that N word again. Here we see an urban intersection where there is no other option than to go into oncoming traffic. Alright, so in this case, the driver in that gray Escort in the left turn lane would ordinarily have the right of way since he has the green arrow, but they appear to be yielding to us. Notice that the green arrow is pretty solidly lit for a long time before we get to the intersection. And there's physically no other route for us to take other than going around into oncoming traffic. All the other traffic appears to be yielding to us, so it seems relatively safe to move into oncoming traffic and make our way through the intersection. Note, though, the speed at which that emergency vehicle driver enters the intersection. We'll talk further about intersection approach speed at a later date. For now, let's go over what we've looked at today. To start with, we should be passing on the left whenever possible when we have our lights activated. If we're passing on the right with our emergency lights on, it should be because it's necessary to do so, not just because it's easier or faster to do so. Lastly, we have to be ever mindful of what the risks of our driving behavior are and balance them against the risks associated with other available options. And we want to pick the option that has the less risk involved given the circumstances. All right, so that's the emergency vehicle's very basic 101. You almost could call it an 098 level class. What turning the lights on means, what we expect from other drivers, and what the circumstances are that we're likely, in fact, really likely to run into where we might have to break some of our guidelines about passing people on the left or going into oncoming traffic, which is something we always would prefer to avoid. Let me know what you thought of this. If it gets a good response, maybe I'll do Emergency Vehicle Operation 102. There's a bunch of other stuff to cover. In fact, you could probably fill 20 or 30 series with tips and tricks. Well, if you like that video, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a whole lot more to come. As soon as I finish up these calls, go 10-8. County 291. 291.